Funerals of billionaires are rarely about grief. They are battlegrounds. While her greedy siblings viciously clawed for the $50 million mansion and offshore accounts, Nora inherited nothing but a rotting, rat-infested 18th century mill. They mercilessly laughed at her worthless prize, until an accidental discovery behind a false brick wall changed everything. The rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Philadelphia law firm felt like a fitting backdrop for a funeral. But the atmosphere inside the mahogany-paneled conference room was anything but sorrowful. It was a war room. At the head of the sprawling teak table sat Frankie Gable, a senior partner whose billable hours could bankrupt a small nation. Across from him sat the heirs of the Harrington real estate empire. Theodore Harrington had been a titan of industry, a man who swallowed up historic landscapes across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, paving them over for luxury subdivisions and corporate parks. When a sudden stroke claimed him at the age of 74, he left behind a fortune that had the financial world holding its breath. Preston Harrington sat with his legs crossed, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit. Beside him, Vivian Harrington Cross checked her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, her silk Hermes scarf draped flawlessly over her shoulders. They were Theodore's children from his second marriage to a pharmaceutical heiress, bred for boardrooms, country clubs, and ruthless acquisition. And then there was Nora. Sitting as far down the table as she could manage, Nora wore a simple wool coat over a faded sweater. She was Theodore's eldest, born to his first wife, a schoolteacher who had loved him before he became a monster of ambition. When Nora's mother passed away, Theodore had effectively erased them from his high society life. Nora hadn't seen her father in 5 years, not since he had offered her a check for $100,000 to stay away from Vivian's society wedding. She had torn the check in half. Frankie Gable cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. He broke the wax seal on the heavy manila envelope. "Let us dispense with the formalities and proceed to the division of assets, as instructed by the deceased," Gable said, adjusting his spectacles. For the next 45 minutes, Gable rattled off numbers that made Nora's head spin. The liquid assets, over $80 million hidden across accounts in Zurich and the Cayman Islands, were divided equally between Preston and Vivian. The fleet of vintage European sports cars went to Preston. The penthouse in Manhattan and the shares in a lucrative biotech firm were handed to Vivian. Then came the crown jewel, the Harrington estate. It was a sprawling $42 million, 50-room limestone manor sitting on 200 acres of pristine Bucks County woodland. The Harrington Manor, including all furnishings and art collections and social collections and outbuildings, is hereby bequeathed jointly to Preston Harrington and Vivian Harrington Cross, Gable read. Preston smirked, catching Vivian's eye. "We'll list it by Tuesday," he whispered loud enough for Nora to hear. "Liquidate the art, raise the West Wing. Sell the land to that commercial developer out of Boston." Nora stared down at her hands. She didn't want the money. She didn't want the cars. She had only come because Gable had sent 3 couriers to her tiny apartment, insisting her father had explicitly demanded her presence. "And finally," Gable said, his voice dropping an octave. He looked up, his eyes resting on Nora with a mixture of pity and confusion. "To my firstborn daughter, Nora, I leave the foundation of everything. The Doylestown grist mill and the immediate half-acre of land upon which it stands." The room went dead silent, and then Vivian let out a sharp, aristocratic snort. "The mill!" Preston barked out a laugh, leaning back in his leather chair. "You mean that decaying pile of timber down by the creek? It's been condemned since 1982. It's an environmental hazard, Gable. The county has been threatening to fine the estate for a decade because of the black mold and the rotting water wheel. Gable offered a tight nod. Be that as it may, it is her inheritance. The property is free and clear, though it does carry a minor burden of back taxes, which Miss Nora will now be responsible for. He left her a tax liability, Vivian cackled, her icy composure breaking. Oh, that is classic Theodore. Even from the grave, he's punishing you for your mother's lack of ambition. Nora's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin high. She remembered the mill. When she was a very little girl, before the Empire, before the private jets, her father used to take her there. He had bought it for practically nothing in the 70s. He used to sit by the creek, hold her hand, and tell her that water always finds a way to cut through the hardest stone. It was the only memory she had of a father who actually possessed a soul. I accept it, Nora said softly. Preston scoffed, leaning forward. Listen to me, Nora. That structure is a lawsuit waiting to happen. If a stiff breeze knocks it over and it blocks the creek, the Department of Environmental Protection will ruin you. I'll do you a favor. I'll write you a check right now for $5,000. I'll bulldoze the eyesore and pave it for overflow parking for the strip mall I'm building down the highway. Nora stood up, buttoning her coat. She looked her half-brother dead in the eye. Keep your money, Preston. You're going to need it to heat that massive empty mansion. She turned and walked out of the conference room, ignoring Gable's sighs and the mocking laughter of her siblings echoing down the marble hallway. 2 weeks later, the reality of her inheritance hit Nora like a physical blow. The old Doylestown grist mill sat at the bottom of a steep, overgrown ravine, choked by thorny vines and weeping willows. The structure was a towering, 4-story behemoth of fieldstone and ancient oak, sagging precariously over the rushing waters of the creek. The roof was missing patches of slate, and the massive wooden water wheel, locked in place by decades of rust and rot, looked like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. Nora unlocked the rusted padlock on the heavy front doors, the hinges screaming in protest as she pulled them open. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth, pulverized grain that had settled a century ago, and the distinct, sharp odor of decay. Sunlight sliced through the broken windows, illuminating billions of dust motes dancing in the cold November air. The floorboards groaned ominously under her boots. I wouldn't step too heavy right there, if I were you, Nora gasped, spinning around. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in a canvas jacket, holding a clipboard and a heavy-duty flashlight. He had dirt smudged across his jaw and an apologetic smile. Sorry. Didn't mean to spook you, he said, stepping inside and testing the floorboards with a heavy work boot. I'm Wyatt Gallagher, Bucks County Historical Conservancy. Your brother's people called us out here. Nora frowned, crossing her arms. My brother doesn't own this property. I do. Wyatt raised an eyebrow, looking down at his clipboard. Well, Preston Harrington filed a demolition permit 3 days ago, claimed the structure was an imminent threat to the local watershed. The county sent me down to do a final historical assessment before they bring the wrecking balls. Rage flared in Nora's chest. Preston was trying to bulldoze her property out from under her using bureaucratic loopholes. He can't do that. It's my land. If it's condemned by the county engineer, he can, especially since his real estate firm owns the surrounding acreage. Wyatt explained gently. He looked around the massive, dusty space, his eyes trailing up the massive timber beams. It's a shame, really. This jointing is spectacular. Mid-1700s, pre-revolutionary architecture. You don't see load-bearing beams cut like this anymore. But honestly, the foundation is sinking into the mud. It would take $1 million to stabilize it. I don't have $1 million, Nora admitted, her shoulders slumping. She looked at the old grinding stones, massive wheels of granite sitting silent in the center of the room. But I can't let him tear it down. Wyatt studied her for a long moment. There was a quiet, stubborn fire in her eyes that he rarely saw in the wealthy heirs he usually dealt with. The only way to stop a demolition order is to prove the site is structurally sound, or to prove it has immense, irrefutable historical significance. I have a few hours before I have to file my report. Want to help me look around? For the next 4 hours, Nora and Wyatt waded through decades of debris. They cleared out rusted farm equipment, rotted sacks of flour that had turned to stone, and endless piles of raccoon nests. As they descended into the basement level, a dark, cavernous space where the main drive shaft from the water wheel pierced the stone wall, the temperature dropped sharply. Wyatt swept his high-powered flashlight over the foundation walls, making notes on his clipboard. Suddenly, he stopped. He tapped the end of his flashlight against the far wall, right behind a massive rusted iron gear. "That's weird," Wyatt muttered. "What is it?" Nora asked, picking her way carefully over a pile of broken slate. Wyatt rubbed the rough fieldstone with his gloved hand. "The mortar. Look at the masonry on the east wall. The stones are irregular, held together by a lime-based mortar mixed with horsehair. Classic 18th century technique. But this section right here..." He tapped a rectangular section of the wall about 5 feet wide. "The stones are perfectly squared, and the mortar is Portland cement. That wasn't invented until much later, and it sounds hollow." Wyatt grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from his tool bag. "Stand back." He wedged the flat edge of the iron bar into a crack in the cement and threw his weight against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp crack, a massive chunk of mortar broke away, revealing not dirt, but dark, heavily oxidized iron underneath. Nora's breath hitched. Wyatt kept working, his muscles straining as he levered out stone after stone. Within 20 minutes, they had uncovered a heavy, cast-iron door forged directly into the foundation. It had no handle, only a rusted keyhole the size of a silver dollar. "Wyatt," Nora whispered. "What is that?" "I have no idea," he breathed. He took his heavy flashlight and smashed the base of it against the rusted locking mechanism. Once, twice on the third strike, the brittle, century-old iron gears inside the lock shattered. Wyatt hooked his pry bar into the edge of the door and pulled. With a sound like a screaming banshee, the heavy iron door swung outward, exhaling a rush of stale, perfectly dry air that smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Wyatt shined his light inside. It wasn't just a hole. It was a reinforced, brick-lined vault. Nora squeezed past him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The small room was pristine, completely protected from the dampness of the creek by a masterclass of hidden engineering. Sitting in the center of the room, on a wooden table, was a heavy brass lockbox, flanked by 3 leather satchels. Nora reached out with trembling hands and unbuckled the nearest satchel. She tipped it forward. A heavy, metallic clinking sound echoed in the small vault. A cascade of heavy gold coins spilled across the table, catching the beam of Wyatt's flashlight and glowing with a warm, mesmerizing fire. Wyatt swore under his breath, picking one up. "My God, these are Spanish escudos and English guineas, 1700s. Nora, this is colonial-era gold." Before Nora could process the staggering wealth sitting casually on the table, she noticed the brass lockbox. It wasn't locked. She flipped the latch and opened the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to preserve them from moisture, were stacks of thick, yellowed parchment. She carefully unfolded the top document. The handwriting was elegant, swirling calligraphy in faded iron gall ink. At the bottom was a heavy red wax seal, and a signature that made Wyatt drop the gold coin he was holding. Benjamin Franklin. But it wasn't the signature that made Nora's blood run cold. It was the text of the document. It was a master land grant, surveying the original property boundaries of the Doylestown grist mill. "Wyatt," Nora whispered, tracing the archaic boundary lines drawn on the map. "Look at this map. The mill property. It isn't just this half-acre." Wyatt leaned over her shoulder, his eyes widening as he read the coordinates. "The original grant gives the owner of the mill the eternal water rights and the foundational deed to the entire surrounding 200 acres. Nora looked up, meeting his shocked gaze. "The 200 acres where my father built the Harrington estate. The mansion. Your father didn't own the land the mansion sits on," Wyatt realized, his voice hollow with disbelief. "He owned the mill, which held the master deed to the land, and he left the mill to you." Before Nora could even begin to comprehend the magnitude of what they had just found, a heavy thud echoed from the floorboards above them. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and numerous. "Hello down there!" A booming, oily voice called out from the main floor. Nora quickly shoved the gold back into the satchel and closed the brass box. She and Wyatt rushed out of the vault, pulling the iron door shut behind them, just as a man in a sharp grey suit descended the rickety wooden stairs, flanked by two massive men in work boots. It was Donovan, Preston Harrington's ruthless lead developer. "Well, well, if it isn't the prodigal daughter," Donovan sneered, looking around the dank basement with absolute disgust. "Your brother sent me. We heard you were down here, playing in the dirt with the Historical Society." "You're trespassing, Donovan," Nora said sharply, stepping in front of the false wall. Donovan chuckled, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "Actually, I'm here to do you a massive favor. Preston is feeling generous. He knows you're broke. He authorized me to offer you $100,000 in cash, right now, to walk away. Sign the deed over to Harrington Firm, and you can go back to your quiet little life." Nora looked at Donovan. She looked at the smirking thugs behind him. A few hours ago, $100,000 would have been life-changing. She would have been tempted. But Preston didn't know what she had found. Or did he? Why the sudden, desperate urgency to buy her out before the demolition? Did Theodore know about the vault? Did Preston find a clue in the mansion's private study? Nora stood taller, the dust of the old mill clinging to her coat like armor. She smiled, a cold, sharp smile that looked exactly like her late father's. "Tell my brother," Nora said softly, "that the price just went up to $42 million, and tell him to start packing." Donovan's smug, arrogant expression dissolved immediately into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. He glanced back at his two hulking associates, suddenly entirely unsure of his footing. Nora's unwavering glare, combined with Wyatt's quiet, imposing presence gripping the heavy iron pry-bar, completely shifted the power dynamic in the damp, freezing basement. $42 million? Donovan scoffed loudly, though his voice notably lacked its previous venomous edge. "You have completely lost your mind, Nora. Preston will have this entire place flattened by Friday afternoon. You get absolutely nothing." "Tell him to try it," Wyatt said, stepping forward so that his broad shoulders shielded the false wall. "This site is now officially under the emergency protection of the State Historical Conservancy. You bring a single bulldozer within a mile of this property line, and I will personally have the federal authorities arrest you for the deliberate destruction of a national heritage site." Donovan swallowed hard, the color draining from his face as he turned on his heel. "You are making a massive, catastrophic mistake," he spat over his shoulder, before storming up the rickety wooden stairs, his silent thugs trailing closely behind him. Once the heavy front doors slammed shut overhead, echoing like a gunshot, Nora finally exhaled a ragged breath she felt she had been holding for a lifetime. Her knees trembled violently, threatening to buckle beneath her, but Wyatt quickly caught her arm, steadying her in the dim light. "We need to move the contents of this vault immediately," Wyatt said, his voice completely serious, stripped of its previous, easygoing warmth. "Tonight. Right now. If Preston sent Donovan down here, it means he deeply suspects there is something valuable hidden onto the grounds. Your father's real estate empire was built entirely on ruthless land grabs and exploiting legal grey areas. Theodore must have known this original master deed existed, and he deliberately hid it to build the mansion on land he did not legally have the title to. By midnight, working silently under the cover of a freezing, starless darkness, Nora and Wyatt had safely transported the heavy leather satchels of colonial gold and the precious brass lockbox to a highly secure, 24-hour safe deposit facility in downtown Philadelphia. The sheer weight of the gold left Nora's arms aching, but her mind was racing with impossible possibilities. The next morning, Nora sat in the cramped, incredibly messy, paper-strewn office of Winston Hayes. Winston was a brilliant, highly eccentric, and notoriously stubborn property litigator who absolutely despised Frankie Gable's sleek corporate law firm. Winston adjusted his thick, tortoise-shell glasses, his eyes widening to the size of saucers as he carefully, reverently read the fragile parchment bearing Benjamin Franklin's undeniable signature. "This is absolutely extraordinary," Winston breathed, leaning back heavily in his creaking leather chair. "Under Pennsylvania colonial property law, which shockingly has never actually been formally overturned in this specific township, a primary grist mill forever holds the foundational water and land rights for the entire surrounding tract. When Theodore built the Harrington estate, he subdivided the land illegally using fraudulent surveyor reports. The deed to the mansion is functionally worthless. The mill owns the land beneath it. The mill owns everything." "Can we actually enforce it?" Nora asked, her knuckles turning white as her hands tightly gripped the arms of her wooden chair. Winston smiled, a slow, incredibly predatory gleam lighting up his sharp eyes. "My dear, we aren't just going to enforce it. We are going to aggressively evict them." The emergency injunction was filed violently at dawn on Tuesday. The legal shockwave hit the Harrington real estate empire like a devastating meteor strike. Preston and Vivian's greedy, fast-tracked plans to liquidate the estate and sell off the land were frozen immediately by a federal judge, much to Frankie Gable's utter dismay. The colonial gold coins, quickly authenticated by Wyatt's museum colleagues, provided Nora with a sudden, massive, multi-million-dollar war chest. This influx of untraceable wealth completely neutralized Preston's favorite legal strategy of bleeding his opponents dry with endless, costly court motions. Nora was ready for a protracted war. Desperate, humiliated, and enraged, Preston recklessly attempted one final, incredibly dirty maneuver. Under the cover of darkness, he hired a private, off-the-books demolition crew to quietly set fire to the old mill, hoping to completely destroy the structure and thereby invalidate the historical, physical anchor of the claim. But Wyatt had brilliantly anticipated the sabotage. He had coordinated heavily with the local police department, who caught the paid arsonists pouring gasoline near the ancient water wheel. The men aggressively folded during the first hour of police interrogation, pointing directly back to Preston's personal payroll account. The ensuing trial became the absolute media spectacle of the entire decade. The grand, mahogany-lined courtroom was packed tightly with breathless reporters, local prominent historians, and stunned high society elites, gleefully watching the dramatic collapse of the previously untouchable Harrington dynasty. Frankie Gable, sweating profusely in his expensive suit, desperately tried every single legal loophole available to invalidate the colonial document. He loudly argued that modern 20th century subdivision laws inherently superseded an archaic 18th century colonial grant. But Winston Hayes dismantled Gable's arguments systematically and brutally. He triumphantly produced century-old, handwritten tax records, undeniably proving the mill had never formally surrendered its master claim. Furthermore, he presented shocking, undeniable evidence that Theodore Harrington had secretly maintained the underground vault, heavily paying off private contractors in the 1980s to install the false wall, knowing exactly the legal landmine it contained. When the stern, grey-haired judge finally slammed her heavy wooden gavel, the definitive ruling was absolute. The title to the $42 million Harrington estate belonged solely, completely, and irrevocably to Nora. Furthermore, a warrant was immediately issued for Preston, who was now formally facing severe criminal charges for attempted arson, and all his corporate assets were frozen, pending a massive federal fraud investigation. Exactly 2 weeks later, the eviction was spectacularly carried out. Nora stood quietly on the grand, sweeping circular driveway of the limestone manor, wearing the exact same faded wool coat she had worn to the reading of the will. Wyatt stood faithfully by her side, a quiet, reassuring, and highly supportive shadow. The heavy imported oak doors of the mansion violently swung open, and Preston stormed out, awkwardly carrying 2 heavy leather suitcases. His once immaculate bespoke suit was badly wrinkled, his face pale, unshaven, and twisted in utter fury. Behind him walked Vivian, desperately hiding her tear-stained, humiliated face behind oversized designer sunglasses, clutching her shivering lapdog. "You planned this," Preston hissed venomously, as he aggressively walked past Nora, his voice trembling with unchecked, impotent rage. "You and that crazy, vindictive old man. He hated us. He always hated our mother. This was his final, sick revenge." Nora watched them angrily load their expensive luggage into a waiting, rented town car. "No, Preston, he didn't hate you. He just knew exactly who you were deep down. He knew you would instantly try to destroy the only piece of true history he ever genuinely loved. He left me the dusty mill because he knew I would defend it." The town car sped recklessly down the long, tree-lined driveway, finally disappearing past the heavy iron gates. The sprawling, opulent mansion was blissfully silent. Nora didn't move in. She had absolutely no desire to live in the cold, cavernous halls of a sterile monument dedicated to corporate greed. Instead, she generously used a significant portion of the Spanish gold to structurally stabilize the mansion, and joyfully handed the keys over to the county government. The Harrington estate was brilliantly transformed into a sprawling public library, a free historical museum, and a lush botanical garden, permanently open to everyone in the community. As for the Doylestown grist mill, Nora poured her entire heart and soul into it. With Wyatt's unparalleled historical expertise and the remaining substantial funds, they painstakingly restored the colossal structure. The rotting, dangerous timbers were carefully replaced with solid, custom-milled oak. The sinking foundation was heavily fortified. Exactly 1 year after Theodore's death, the entire county gathered joyously along the muddy banks of the creek to watch as the massive, newly restored wooden water wheel began to turn for the very first time in a century. It groaned beautifully, churning the rushing cold water into a brilliant, sparkling white foam. Nora stood proudly on the wooden observation deck, deeply feeling the powerful vibration of the great gears thrumming wildly under her boots. It was the powerful heartbeat of the mill, fully alive and roaring once again. She had nervously walked into that intimidating law office 12 months ago with absolutely nothing, casually dismissed as the worthless, forgotten daughter. Now, she had triumphantly rewritten history. She had fiercely saved the past, bravely conquered the present, and finally, undeniably, found her true home. If you loved this thrilling story of hidden wealth and satisfying revenge, please hit that like button right now. Every single share helps us grow and bring you more incredible tales of historical mysteries unfolding. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. What would you have done with the dusty mill? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and stay wonderfully curious today.